Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you near and afar. Obviously, people dialing in from all around the world, different time zones, etc. So some of you may even be in your pajamas. So welcome. We're pretty privileged to be surrounded by not just three, but four experts in critical risk management and serious injury fatality prevention. So the title says three, but we also have my co-founder, Warren Smith, joining us as well. So yeah, welcome, Warren.
Thanks, Alex.
And also the likes of three others on the panel who you're probably all familiar with. Trish, I might throw to you just to introduce yourself and a bit about what you do and obviously your current pursuits in Lead Like Karen.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here. So, my background is mechanical engineering, and I've worked in process safety for most of my career now. I've worked in downstream oil and gas, in chemical manufacturing, and in gas production and distribution. More recently, for the last 11 years, I was the inaugural director of the Institution of Chemical Engineers Safety Centre, which focused on process safety and helping companies share and learn. And I've just branched out with my own business now, focusing on process safety, leadership, and governance in particular. And that's called Lead Like Karen. So that's who I'm representing today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Trish. Um, and I'll also love to introduce you to Anthony Deakin. Anthony, we've obviously worked a fair bit in the high hazard industries with critical risk and control management. Yeah, give us a bit of a background in terms of what you do, Anthony.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, like you said, been working with you for a few years now. I work as an independent consultant in my own business, Glasshouse Consulting, and we specialize in, the designing and deploying of critical risk and related programs into high hazard industries. Prior to consulting, I worked for 12 years leading the safety risk group in Rio Tinto. So my a lot of exposure into the mining industry. Thanks, Alex.
Fantastic, Anthony. And you're pretty modest there. I think being co-author of contributing to the ICMM guidelines is not a small feat in itself. So yeah, appreciate all the work you do in this space as well. And Don Martin, calling in from Florida. Appreciate you staying up in your pajamas to join us over on this side of the world. Don, tell us a bit about what you've been doing over the last 40 years in a
Thanks, Alice.
nutshell.
I'm fully dressed, and a glass of wine is waiting for me at the end of the at this webinar. But I've been in the safety and risk management profession for well over 40 years. 20 plus years of that was in industry as an EHS director. The last 20 plus years has been in consulting, and the last 15 years of that I've been really dedicated to this whole subject, serious injury and fatality prevention. And I recently retired from full-time work, and just like all of my other awesome, esteemed colleagues on this call, I've started my own independent consulting firm, and I'm very happy to be here and excited to be able to talk SIF with a lot of other like-minded professionals.
Yeah, fantastic. So look, undoubtedly, I'm going to have the most envied job of herding the cats around some very, very passionate, energized people here. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Alex Fernando, so also co-founder of Instant Analytics. And the purpose of this webinar is really to try and scaffold around some of our initial research that we've released. I think Holly's dropped the white paper into the chat, so if you haven't got access to it, you do now. And if you haven't read it, there's certainly a couple of webinars that talk to it in a bit more depth. And really, the intent is here to have a really meaningful discussion around exploring challenges and solutions around SIF misclassification, the pitfalls, and over reliance on controls, and how to really approach probably how to reduce repeat SIF incidents inherently. And I think leveraging the expertise in this room here will probably go in all sorts of different directions, but we'll try and channel it to an area that best suits your interests. So if you do have questions or things that you'd like to kind of unpack, feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A in the chat as well. Holly did mention that, and as did I, around the research. So I might just baseline everyone's understanding of the baseline research that I might ask Warren to just walk us through very quickly. So it's a pretty expansive study, Warren. I think probably the largest SIF study that we've seen released here. So could you just give us a bit of background context around the dimensions and scale of the research? Warren, if you're still around. That looks like we've lost Warren for a second.
Oh, he's
His
back.
internet might
No,
have
no,
gone
you
down.
didn't. Sorry. Yeah, I had somebody come to the door and a dog started barking furiously. So that's the
Right.
last thing I need to put everybody through.
Too easy.
So apologies for that. Yeah, so I'm picking up where I'm expecting you to have just been, Alex.
Yeah,
Obviously,
just give us a just baseline everyone's working understanding of the research.
sure.
So it's obviously a fairly large study across 12 countries and multiple industries. And so if you can kind of give us a bit of a sense of the size and scale of that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. It's so that there's a series of research events with research partners, from large global entities, down to sort of smaller local ones in Australia, covering a lot of industry sectors. And we felt that was important because we wanted to understand, we know about mining. Mining has a very high profile when it comes to high hazard research into serious events, but we want to understand more about, some of the smaller, sort of less high profile industry sectors. So if you just flip to the next slide, Alex, we've got about 10,000 incidents have been reviewed. So those incident reports that we've looked at, quite deeply for the mechanisms of failure, we're trying to understand, in each of those events, which of those would have, if not for luck, turned into a serious outcome. We extracted about 680 incidents out of 5,000 that we felt had enough information for us to make a fairly accurate call on serious injury or fatality risk. And from that, we then more deeply investigated about 1,000 or more than 1,000 controls that have failed in those situations that have set the event up for the incident itself. And we're particularly interested in why those controls didn't get implemented as they needed to be at the time. So it's a very substantial database now, and we're leveraging that to try and understand more about why these events are occurring and what to do about that. Now, the 6 key things that came up for us that were really probably standouts, and we talked about this in our last webinar, that most serious incidents, talk about 5 in 6, don't get classified as serious by the organisations that that it occurs with. So we're talking about 84%, I believe, and I'll look at that a little more deeply on the next slide. But the fact that most of those incidents don't actually hit the radar as a major or potentially extreme event did say something to us about the way in which organisations are actually classifying incidents. The other issue, of course, for us is that controls, why do they not get implemented? Well, not all of them are actually set up for success, and not all controls are enabled for workers to be, to implement them easily in the field. That was quite a fascinating outcome for us. When it came to the investigations themselves, and we were looking at the organisation's ability to be able to extract accurate and clear causality, in each of those incidents, the human error component not identified particularly accurately in most of those investigations. So that was an interesting finding for us as well, and we'll go more deeply into that down the track in a future webinar. Factors relating to how operations are managed. Very, very important issue. We're talking about who sets the scene for how controls are implemented. Largely, it's about supervisors, managers, leaders, maintenance practices. A whole range of issues there affect how likely a worker is going to be, in a position to implement that control as they need to. Interesting, the organisational system issues in that number 5 there. Difficult to extract from each incident, but we certainly got a very good view about organisational system issues that sit way upstream of the event and how they affect whether controls get implemented in the field. And the last point there, motor vehicle and gravity related incidents, very high profile because they're high in number. Those were the 2 dominant types of classifications of incidents. So we've actually got quite a lot of work done in terms of trying to understand those 2 particular categories of risk. And we'll go into those in far more detail in future webinars as well.
Yeah, sure. Appreciate that, Warren. I think clearly there's a fair bit of data that was underpinning our research, and we've only released a subset of that, and we're expecting the next tranche of that's going to go deeper into controls and the nature of the fact that not all controls are equal. which could be fairly contentious in some circles. So we're really looking forward to releasing that data and go a bit deeper in that as well. But look, just in terms of just getting a bit of engagement from those of you on the call, I wouldn't mind just sharing a bit of a poll here just to canvass some of the issues that you're seeing in classification of high potential incidents, or SIFp potential incidents, as some would call them. I do believe we've got an issue with the poll, but I'm going to have a crack at launching it myself. Let's see. So you should be seeing a poll question here. And really what we're trying to do is understand what your biggest challenges are in terms of accurate high potential or SIFp potential incidents are. So some of you might experience or might resonate with you that inconsistent classification criteria is one of those key kind of challenges for you. Conversation earlier that Anthony and I had was around the nature of control breaches. Is that considered a SIFp potential event or not? In other circles, lack of leadership engagement, governance, or even knowledge to even inquire about high potential events is one of those factors. Clearly, fear of reporting due to KPIs or incentives is a factor, because of course if there's underlying culture of fear, or there's particular incentives or KPIs driving reporting, then that has an influence on better understanding and learning from high potential events. And of course, overburdened investigation. So if we're investigating everything, then of course we're limiting our capacity to investigate the right incidents. So if you don't mind kind of sharing your perspectives on that, and Anthony, Don, Trish, if you've got some perspectives on those kinds of issues, feel free to share your thoughts. So I might just end the poll, and it should share results. Is it sharing results now? Fantastic. What are your thoughts, team?
There's quite an even distribution between all the responses, and it's indicative to me that it's hard to know from site to site, company to company, what the criteria is for determining that an event does or does not have SIF potential.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly looks like lack of leadership engagement, effective governance, or knowledge. Obviously, there's three big, probably related but different things are also driving classification.
Yeah, and fear of the unknown. Like if I do call it SIF potential, what happens next? Does somebody get in trouble?
I have to admit, I'm a bit surprised that it's only 13% of fear of reporting due to KPIs or incentives. I actually probably would have expected to see a little bit higher there, given how incentives can really result in perverse outcomes.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm surprised at that one as well, and it's obviously reflective of who's participating in the poll as well. Any thoughts from you, Anthony?
Oh, a bit like Don and Karen, Trish, they're really intertwined, I think. Like they're all fairly dependent on each other. One thing I would say is I think in some of those, like the investigation burden, it is quite easy to deal with that, through, for example, not saying that every single SIFP requires a full investigation, if the learning potential is not there. So when you look at each of those items independently, there are things that you can do to mitigate those concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the questions that comes to mind for me is why do we even care? What does it mean to the organisation, or even more so, why is it crucial for the worker? The people on the ground, faced with the exposure itself. Any thoughts from you, Anthony, on that?
Well, I think I'm actually going to steal something that I think Don, maybe you could elaborate on it, but I think in a preamble to this, you talked about really focusing our attention towards what the workers in the real world are most concerned about. And I think, it's about what they fear most. And I really like that idea of, at the end of the day, if we don't orientate our programs around what is concrete and tangible and indisputable and what workers really buy into, and leaders really buy into, we're on the sidelines. We're not front and center in the field. I think that was a really critical observation that I think Don mentioned. Maybe I've stolen your thunder there, Don, but over to you.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I think you're exactly right that what we've learned from our experience, and I've worked with over 200 companies on SIF prevention systems. And one of the big things that we keep learning is that when we go out into the field, like you were describing, and having a very honest conversation with the workers about what they're up against every day. So what's the real system that they work in? They'll start describing frustrations that they have. They'll describe what they're exposed to, and they'll start describing some of the workarounds that they have to invent to get their jobs done. And when you're in this SIF risk environment, working at height, hazardous energy, that type of thing, suspended loads, confined spaces, those workarounds can be life-threatening. And this is what they start talking about is how protected am I when I'm performing this job in this situation, in this circumstance? And I know I had this feeling that I'm not as well protected as I could be. So that's SIF potential happening real time out in the field. And the more we understand that and the more we know about it, the better able we are as safety professionals, executives, and managers to start to control that. Because now you can have a conversation about critical controls, which ones are present, which ones are not present, which ones are performing, which ones are not performing. And then you could start this ball rolling just by getting out into the field and having that real world conversation.
I think that's gold, Alex. Like, so, to your comment about why do we really care? Well, because if we set up systems that don't allow us to unlock those sort of honest conversations with the front line, we just get stuck in this cycle of the same incidents over and over. And so, yeah, I think that's really the main aim is that, we're trying to drive particular behaviors or outcomes. We need to make sure our system is enabling, not restricting those.
I'll just add in there that I think it's really critical in terms of building trust in the workforce as well. And that's a key part of culture. And a key underpinning element that's required for trust in any interaction or relationship is, do you actually care about my needs? And having these deep and meaningful discussions about this is a way to demonstrate, as leaders in an organization, we actually care about the people that work for us and that work with us. Because if we don't have that care factor in there, then there is no trust, and then people are not going to tell us and be honest about what we need to know.
Oh, look, you flag a really important point there, TK. I was going to say, Trish. Yeah, we've worked with a number of organisations where they attempt to, and I think genuinely want to learn from unplanned events and serious unplanned events, and even go to the extent of tracking high potential or SIFp potential as a metric. But of course, they're constantly battling how to best classify, how to differentiate between one SIFp potential event and a non-SIFp potential event. And then, of course, you've got the tyranny of lagging indicators and lost time injuries and TRIFR and things like that. And so we have found that some organisations do embrace SIFp potential, but of course it's not that easy to kind of find the nuances between what SIFp potential is and what it's not. So Warren, I might throw to you, maybe if you could share what the research is saying to us about
Sure.
the extent of misclassification. And
I'll just add before you bring that up, Alex.
Yeah,
please bring it up as we're talking. But I just add to that conversation that it's not surprising that we've got many organisations are still struggling with this a little bit. When you think about the decades we took back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, just getting aligned around a very clear approach to measuring lost time injury and TRIFR rates and things like that. It took us a while to kind of get galvanized around a standard, in that space now. And this big shift that's happened probably, and Don's had a big role to play, obviously, in that, because, you've been in this game now for, probably a couple of decades, helping organizations to understand there's another thing here that's actually worth looking at. It's really worth looking at. And we're still in the process, I think, of having organisations settle into an understanding about what that really means for them. But I think we're getting there much, much faster now, especially with directors and executives being responsible or on the hook, for understanding why controls might be failing in their business. So yes, this research was really like it blew us away a little bit. And we found out that so many incidents were not being viewed as serious at all. And I think this is the concept of potential is a problem for most organisations. Potential versus actual. It's easy when you see something that's actually a serious incident or has a serious harm outcome. But events that have potential for it, for a lot of people, it's a very rubbery concept about judging that. So we've had to develop a very strict kind of decision tree process around that. And there's a number of ideas floating around these days around how to actually ascertain or make a distinction between a SIFp potential and a non-SIFp potential incident. But the finding number 2 here was interesting too. I mean, not only did a hell of a lot of SIFp potential incidents fly under the radar, but a number were actually probably over-invested in that organisations felt were serious. But in our view, there was really no SIFp potential at all. And that's about half of them, actually. So you think about the overinvestment in investigations as well as the underinvestment. It's about targeting that effort at absolutely the right incidents. And we might find that our net effort doesn't change, but we just become far more targeted at the right ones.
Yeah, I think there's some comments coming from the participants. So Simon's saying, there's the lack of understanding of what the potential incident actually is. Ellen even throwing to lower classification gets lost in the prioritisation of SIFp potential. So it's again this issue competing drivers in the organisation, but also potentially the system itself isn't wide to differentiate, but also people or knowledge isn't necessarily tuned into those nuances as well. Yeah. In terms of the extent to which we've got the misclassification, Warren, this data here was really quite telling in that there's quite a disparity between how an organisation views almost their risk appetite around these things versus the actual SIFp potential. Can you just expand on this?
It's just important to clarify this a little bit. We had obviously many organisations in this study. What was really fascinating was just about all of them had a 5-point scale for severity assessment. And some of the language slightly changed, but really fundamentally we're talking about this sort of 5-step or 5-point scale from either extreme or catastrophic all the way down to negligible or insignificant. Interesting that 238 in the black part of the bar on the right hand side there, 238, 110 and 128, which is 238 incidents out of the total study of 680 fell into insignificant or minor classifications by those organisations. Nearly a couple of hundred fell into moderate. And some people might say, well, that's one of those sort of middling areas where you could say, well, there's some significance to those events. But we really feel that if you're calling something out as major or potentially catastrophic, you're going to take that very seriously. And only 82 out of the total data set sort of fell into those classifications. So there's a big gap there in terms of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does this mean in terms of using high potential incidents or SIFp potential as a safety metric? I mean, can you kind of expand that? Because we've certainly had a lot of clients try to do that, but then lose their way every now and again.
We're seeing more and more more executive teams, possibly pressed by board members that have realised that they need to up the standard of vigilance around assurance in this space. Wanting to use this as a metric, and unfortunately, then a metric's great. Like having a metric around your SIF exposure, which is the number of SIF potential incidents as a proportion of your total incident base. It's a useful metric to have because you can move that up and down depending upon what you do and how much focus you place on critical risk management rather than just simply, all of your slips, trips, falls. The problem is when you attach it to leadership KPIs, and even worse, you attach it to their reward and recognition processes. In other words, now it's going to hit their hip pocket. That becomes a problem, because then we see the same old stuff that happened with lost time injury. We see gaming of the system. We see a reluctance to call things out, which means all the learning opportunities tend to fly once again under the radar. So, we've had that experience with organisations we've worked with, Alex, this year and last year. We've found that out. Yeah,
absolutely. How does that resonate with you, Anthony? What are your thoughts? Because you've obviously you work across a lot of high hazard organisations.
100% with Warren's view on all of that. Look, I think it's a good metric. It's just that it's misused and abused and game played over time. But if you come back to the fundamentals of should we be measuring and understanding the actual and potential significant incidences and the controls that failed, well, the answer has to be yes, doesn't it? I mean, it's one part of the puzzle. Clearly, it needs to be combined in with the more leading indicator around critical control verifications, if I can call that a leading indicator. But that lead lag connection is critical. And we know that when we combine or triangulate the CCV data and the incident data, it gives us an even richer view around, where are our controls failing in practice from field or system reviews versus in practice in reality. So I think that's a really critical perspective also.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Anthony. And I think interesting to see, Trish, do you see parallels from what Anthony's seeing in your sectors?
So one of the things that I talk a lot about, particularly to senior executives and boards, is what's known as Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Some of you might be more familiar with it in terms of the Cobra effect is another way to explain it. And one of the challenges I have is we need to measure a whole lot of things in our organisation so we can manage them. But not everything needs a target, because the moment we actually start putting targets on things, we then do start to drive this perverse behaviour where you set people a target, they'll achieve it. Are they actually achieving it, or are they just achieving the number? And that's essentially the fundamental aspect of what Goodhart's law is about. And the classic argument that we've seen of, no, it's not a lost time injury, and we'll spend hours or even days arguing that. I see exactly the same parallels in process safety, where we spend hours or days arguing about the classification difference between a tier 1 process safety event and a tier 2 process safety event, or even a tier 3 level spill, which is smaller than a tier 2. So we definitely see these issues where when we get so focused on the classification because we have targets around it, we end up with driving enormous busyness in an organisation. It doesn't deliver any learning about whether we have any further understanding of our critical controls and whether they're effective or not. And fundamentally, that's what it's got to come down to. How effective are our controls? Because if they're not effective, we need to do something. We need to do something significant to fix that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your line of thinking around this, Trish. I think let's unpack that arguing around the classification piece.
Can I weigh in?
Please.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I would just say I love your two perspectives on this, because they're spot on with the way I'm thinking as well. And the one thing I would add to this conversation is that using an SIF potential metric the right way, it's an awareness metric. It's not a targeted objective to chase after. It is an awareness metric because it puts the recordable injury rate into some kind of perspective or context. So, what percentage of my recordable injuries or reported near misses, what percentage of them have true SIF potential? And that gives the executives an idea about what their vulnerability is to experiencing an actual SIF event. And so it is a very powerful metric, but used the right way for awareness purposes.
Look, spot on, Don. I think, yeah, it's certainly, we would advocate for it not being used as a KPI or a performance measure of any sort. It's really around, and the irony is that the more that people tune into SIF potential, the more reporting you actually get of it. And that's really, really healthy because it maximizes your ability to learn from those events and also tends to shift away the disproportionate level of effort on things that aren't SIF potential events. So your investigation burden tends to be more attenuated to where the more the value is. But I'm keen to unpack how we actually make that distinction between SIF potential and SIF not. And in fact, I've got a couple of queries on the chat asking for clarity around it. So Warren, it's a good segue just to unpack a bit in terms of how we make that determination ourselves. I should be sharing screens again.
Yep, you are. That's perfect, Alex. So the first precondition for us when we think about, is this a SIF potential situation or not, is like, does the event fall into a high risk context where we know, from our history, we know from the kind of work we do in this organisation, for instance, that, we can see a demonstrated risk of a bad event happening. So there's some of the classic symbols that you would see, confined space, fall from height, suspended load. And I think most of the people on, who are actually in the audience of this webinar would understand all of those potential mechanisms or those risk contexts where you'd see them as classical, like high risk or hypo, kind of environments. The key question for us, though, is that once we can say yes to that, we're then concerned with, the probability of the potential event. Because as we know, actual SIF events are very rare. So it's potential events that we actually want to extract and get at. So we have to make some sort of judgment. We need some sort of judgment criteria about that potential. And our question is very simple. We take a binary approach. We're not interested in trying to make a graduated sort of, high, not so high, a little bit lower. We think it's binary. Is it yes SIF potential or no SIF potential? And we're just asking ourselves the question, if just one thing changed, could this event have credibly resulted in a fatality or serious injury? So if you can imagine, just to give you a simple example, I've got a maintenance dude up on the roof, a flat roof building, and he's fixing some flashing. And he's in the middle of the roof. He doesn't have any kind of harness or anchor point, to protect him if he goes near the edge. So in that particular moment, do we have SIF potential? Not really. But if he moves closer to the edge of the building, he still doesn't have any protective, PPE on, and he starts to get within 2 meters of the open edge of that building. We would say, yes, we do have SIF potential now, because we only have to have one thing change, which is he loses balance, or he gets so close to the edge, that he trips on something, and then we have a fall from height situation. So there only has to be one legitimate change possibility, and it has to be legitimate. It has to be a credible possibility. We can't have acts of God involved in that. And once we have that test, passed as a yes, then we go to the next step, which is, what does that look like? The probability test, because it is important here that we understand and make a judgment call based on knowledge, history, incidents that have happened in our organisation. What's the likelihood of that one change actually happening? And if we know that the possibility of somebody tripping on something where there's not particularly good housekeeping is fairly high, then we're going to say absolutely. If there's a perfectly flat space, and we don't believe that there's actually much chance of it happening, it's possible, but it's highly unlikely, then we would probably say no. Once again, each of these steps is still a judgment call. But it's a judgment call that's starting to refine itself with more consistency. And this is the key, Alex, that you and I have found, is that the consistency with which people apply even their own rules, whatever their own rules are, a risk matrix, whatever it is usually pretty awful in most organisations. And we've tried to build a process where you can have calibrated and consistent approach to assessment. And we believe that this one does.
Yeah, we've certainly had to attenuate and there's obviously a bit of complexity that underpins this. This is obviously a simplified decision tree, but we've had to attenuate this to the operating context of the organizations themselves. So you're kind of building on not just a generic decision tree, but certainly something that's attenuated or to the operating context.
They're like
Anthony,
having performance standards, Alex. It's like having performance standards and controls. You need performance standards applied to each of those risk categories that help to define, the like speed of a vehicle moving,
yeah,
proximity of a forklift to a pedestrian, etc. Yeah.
no, that's a much better way of framing it.
Mm.
Anthony, what have you seen around this with your clients? So you obviously do a lot of work across other high risk industries. Is this an issue
Yeah.
that you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely, Alex. And I like the way Warren couched it, that there's still a judgment call to be made within the framework. But we've got some logical, discrete steps that you can you can work through. You can never write every possible scenario out, albeit people have tried. And I know Warren has done that as far as practically possible, which I think is really important. But even he would say, I don't cover every scenario. The one thing if I understand correctly, which I think is important, is around that one if test. So we would say in the example that Warren gave, there was no actual energy exchange that occurred. There was no rock that fell. No one fell themselves. No vehicle rolled over. But if one thing changed, it could have. So I think that that point around, you don't have to have an actual energy exchange for it to be an incident. I fully agree with that. The second thing is, you don't have to have a person present necessarily for it to be a potential also. If the load fell into an unbarricaded area, or even if it fell into a barricaded area, but we know that people often go into the barricading, such as the person controlling the lift, that potential exists. So I think that's a really important point. We know it's easier to categorize where there is an actual energy exchange because we've lived it, and we're further right on the kind of bow tie or the incident sequence. Event trees are easier to build, so we can get our head around that. When we look at the kind of left-hand side where there hasn't yet been an energy exchange, that is a bit more challenging. But I think we have to make sure that we're considering those events. That's probably, I think that maybe, Don, your view around those kind of potential scenarios. Any reflections on that?
First of all, I'm a big fan of the binary approach.
Yeah.
That it either an incident either does or does not have SIF potential. I don't think that there are credibly there are no degrees of potential. So I really like saying just yes or no. And then the likelihood that only one thing has to change. So the likelihood is either possible or not possible because it's either happened here or it's happened somewhere else, makes it possible. And so I think that keeps it a lot cleaner. These other more complicated ranking schemes, 5 degrees of SIF potential or 5x5 matrices, they give you the illusion of accuracy because that mathematically they look to be very accurate and very precise, but they don't really tell you the truth about whether there's potential present or not in the real world situations. So I think it's important to orient ourselves toward this, yes, no, binary type thinking.
Yeah, look, I'm keen to understand. Extending on that, how do you break the repeat SIF cycle? So, we've got. If you could imagine that you could classify the incidents accurately, you could determine which ones are SIF yes, and you spend enough time investigating, learning, and remediating those circumstances and strengthening controls. Why are we seeing repeat incidents of a similar nature? Like I know that the data Warren and we can talk to that in a second. But motor vehicle is an example shortly. But there's a lot of repeat SIF incidents. So why is that still occurring?
I, I've got one reflection on that, Alex.
Yeah.
I feel quite strongly that organizations have got themselves into just doing the transactional work of, do a verification, find a red, fix a red. Do a verification, find a red, fix a red. I call it it's the do loop cycle,
Yeah,
where we
right.
just find it, fix it, find it, fix it, find it, fix it. And then we're surprised when the same incident happens again. I mean, most organizations I work with do not yet have the annual review by the control or the risk
Mm.
owner to really get into the data around why are those control incidents reoccurring? Why are those controls failing? Is that control still relevant to the nature and scale and context of our business, or is there a better control that we could implement? So we're not looking at the controls from that kind of helicopter view often. We just seem to get stuck in the trenches, sort of feeding the system. So I think for me, building into the process, the need to actually raise above the day to day and look a little bit more strategically at the controls rather than tactically is really
Mm.
important. So I think that's some of the value in this work that Warren's done to really unpack why do certain types of controls routinely fail and actually do something about it.
Yeah, good. And what are you saying, Trish? Any reflections on?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges is in process safety. Trevor Kletz once said, organizations have no memory, only people have memory. And so I think for me, this comes down a lot to inability as an organization to learn. And so, if we're in a situation where we've had this issue, as Anthony said, we've got the do loop. So we just keep fixing the things that we find, which sounds
Mm.
great as an idea, as a concept to start with. If we're not actually fixing the real issue, we're just occupying ourselves. And often we end up with going down this human factors approach or lack of human factors,
Mm.
where it's administrative controls that we put in place. And fundamentally, if we're at a situation where we need a human to get it 100% right every time, or we are going to have a SIF event,
Yeah.
there's something very wrong with that system, and the system lacks resilience. And we need to go back and we need to be focusing on that engineering aspect of it, because we cannot rely only on people remembering and people following procedures, because something's going to happen one day and someone's going to make a mistake on something. If it's possible to make that mistake, it'll happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely inevitable, isn't it? And that's probably throws to the fact that we have these repeat SIF incidents because we're stuck in the do loop, as Anthony says, and we're probably remediating with the same fixes as we always have, right? So, what was
Can I just build
yeah,
quickly
please
on what
go for it.
You made a really good point there, Trish, which is that we've got we've got an inadequate understanding in most organisations about the mechanism, the actual real mechanism of failure. So if we're talking about a human handling a really complex, multi-step process,
Mm.
we know through human factors research what the likelihood of the failure rate is going to be, the error rate. If we know that, and we've got evidence of controls, the same controls repeatedly failing over time, and we've then got a case to make to invest in actually improving that control, which is typically going to cost money. The minute you move into an engineering solution or an engineered solution, it's going to be far, far more expensive perhaps than just relying upon somebody to do something right 100% of the time. But at least then you've got the data to make an informed decision about investing in that one targeted solution rather than trying to boil the ocean across your entire control framework. And I think that's the value of having that data, like real analysed data around control failures, what actually allowed that control to fail in the first place. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, Warren, what you extend that into motor vehicles, because I think some of our data does go deep into motor vehicle
Yes, it was fascinating
SIF
because
potential. So be a good one to
look,
unpack.
we'd expect with fatalities being so unfortunately high, if you look at the fatality data in Australia, for instance, we've got, it's gravity, but above gravity is motor vehicles. And there's lots of different mechanisms or different ways in which a motor vehicle can cause, can be part of a SIFp potential event. Obviously, there's usually a vehicle, a mobile equipment operator involved, a driver. And we know that those events form the basis for almost up to a third of all fatalities. And almost a third of our SIFp potential events as well. So there's that green line, which is telling you the frequency of those SIFp potential events in our data set. So imagine 680 we had to start with. More than 200 of them come out of motor vehicles. The rating integrity, their SIFp potential rating integrity amongst the lowest. In fact, I think it was the actual lowest at around 8-9%. So more than 9 in 10 SIFp potential events with motor vehicles do not get treated as serious by most organisations. Not by all organisations necessarily, but by most, that would be the case. Certainly in our data set, and it's a fairly wide one. When you break it out in terms of different types of motor vehicle events, the different contexts, because it's very different to have a trailer disconnect or a load move or a load fall than, say, a collision or impact on a pedestrian. They're all very, very different contexts with different kinds of controls, some behavioural, some mechanical integrity based, some inspection based. There's a whole variety. Most of them, unfortunately, are behavioural, Alex, as we probably called out. We have a very, very heavy reliance with motor vehicle controls being a person doing a thing in the right way at the right time with the right kind of attentive focus. And that's why it's such an unreliable task to have controlled.
Yeah, absolutely. Don, what are you seeing in the space? Any reflections on the data that we've unearthed, so to speak?
My experience has been that this motor vehicle incident SIF risk is probably one of the single most complicated issues that we face in the workplace. My experience has been it's almost always the SIF risk that organizations face. And yet it's also the thing that most executive teams that I've worked with don't believe it's their responsibility to do something about. They are very comfortable believing that this is somebody else's responsibility. It belongs to the Department of Transportation. It belongs to the Highway Safety Department. It belongs to the insurance companies. It belongs to
the contractors,
the law enforcement agencies, right? So they really like to think that it's out of their control. But I know that there are companies whose executives have decided that this is completely unacceptable point of view, that they must be advocates for zero fatalities occurring on motor vehicle roadways. Once they start adopting this zero mindset, zero fatality mindset on motor vehicles, a lot of things can happen. So there are, and you guys are all aware of this, there are standards out there like the ANSI Z15 standard that talks about the practices for motor vehicle operations. It gets into the number one thing is leadership commitment to this process. It talks about journey management. It talks about vehicle procurement. It gets into the technologies that are available in our vehicles, driver training, cell phone use, fatigue risk. And the more an executive understands the framework for a system like this, the more power they have to actually sponsor those types of activities inside their organization. And then when you couple that, so that's motor vehicles over the road. Think about countries like Sweden and Norway that have tackled this head on at the parliament level. And they're going beyond just blaming the driver for being a bad driver or installing more technologies in the car. They're looking at the roadway systems. How can we build and manage safer roadway transport systems for people? And so it's a huge issue. It's really complicated, but these executives have to be willing to get involved in that, and it's messy. And so once that gets started, Then you start also coupling this with in-plant vehicles. So mobile equipment, forklifts, dump trucks,
Yeah.
things like that. You combine that in-plant mobile equipment issue with this over-the-road motor vehicle issue, it is by far the single biggest SIF risk that companies face.
Yeah, absolutely. And Don, I'm keen to just touch on briefly on the leadership role of leadership and governance. And maybe Trish, you obviously do a fair bit in this space as well. Any quick parting comments or thoughts around governance around this space and leadership?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I
so
think leaders have to understand this whole issue of critical controls. And I think I'd like to hear more from our panelists on that. But this whole idea that the more executives know about whether the critical controls that they expect to be in place are actually in place and performing with evidence coming from the field, so they
Mhm.
have, fact-based opinions. That is a super important thing. And Trish, I cut you off.
no worries. Yeah, I think I did some research a few years ago into how do we actually help organizations learn? Because fundamentally, that's what we're missing here. It's around some of that learning of what's going on. And I identified that there were actually 5 key areas that leaders need to step up in and do things a bit differently
Excellent.
to deliver these outcomes.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's around leaders need to be willing to encourage their teams to explore and be curious. So curiosity is one of the key elements I see missing from workplaces all over the world at both leadership and worker level. So being curious and encouraging that, challenging the status quo and assumptions and making sure that we can actually get, different opinions on the table, resourcing the organization to do what it needs to do. Because as leaders, they're the people that can actually provide those resources. But one of the key things we often miss is time,
Mm.
resourcing people with enough time to actually reflect on what occurred. Otherwise, we just have an experience. We can have an experience, but until we reflect on what occurred in it, we don't actually turn that into a true learning. And so we need time to do that. We need to give people the tools and the freedom to be able to experiment safely with new solutions. So, management of change is critical in that experimentation as well. And lastly, listening to the workers, being curious and asking the questions and genuinely listening to what they have to say and figuring out what it means so we can take the right steps going forward. And I think there's some key areas from a leadership and governance perspective where we
Mhm.
can really make a difference in how we understand what's going on. So when we couple that with the model here around how to determine the SIF potential and then learn what our controls are and what the effectiveness of those is, then putting that into place requires this last learning part.
Yeah, fantastic. And Trish, there's a few comments coming through the thread where people find what you've just said quite resonating. And look, I think it's worthy for us to create a tiny bit of space and time for a few Q&A. So what I'll do is, if I can encourage everyone to, if there's anything that prompted or resonated with you and has cause for a bit more fleshing out, please put your questions into the chat or into the Q&A section.
Can I
While you,
respond to Ellen asked a question before
yeah,
that I
go for it.
noticed, and look, it's a really good question that she asked. We're still talking about making judgment, like the judgment-based criteria for even understanding what a SIF potential event is in the first place.
Mm,
You're not going to get away from it. I just want to respond to that and say, acknowledge what she's saying. She's absolutely right. Human judgment is going to be involved in all of your criteria, criteria for assessing a SIF potential event. The idea is to narrow the bandwidth of that judgment down as much as possible in order to be able to create a more calibrated and consistent approach to it. Inevitably, though, every organisation highly individual in terms of their risk profile. They've got different equipment. Their procedures are different. The mechanisms of failure are going to be different. You actually have to customize the approach to your own organization, but then keep it the same, keep it consistent over time. And of course, all those factors that Don and Trish and Anthony have talked about that can get in the way and start sort of insidiously infiltrating that process. You've got to make sure that they don't affect how you make those judgments. If anybody wants to talk about that down the track and just in terms of their own context, at the end of this, please, get in touch directly with us. Happy to have a 15 half-hour chat about this to help you kind of help to frame that for your own context.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Warren's point, if you just type yes into the chat, happy to carve out some time with any one of the panelists here if you wanted to kind of just explore a few, because we've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. So it's worthy of several webinars. But I think if you wanted to have some one-on-one time, feel free to, or just type yes into the chat. I should probably just throw to the other point that the AIHS, the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, have actually endorsed the scale serious incident analysis learning method that we've put together and promoted as part of their professional development. That's a pretty key milestone for incident analytics, but also for the profession as a whole. So if you do want to find out more about that, type yes into the chat or scan the QR code. But what I'll do is just very quickly throw to a couple of extra questions that have come through. Okay.
Lots of good reflections.
Yeah, there
not a lot
are.
of questions.
I'm just trying to work out what are questions and what are reflections. Okay, so great conversations. Interested in your view of the effectiveness of roam exercises where people are set a target of doing one roam observation each week. I'm not entirely familiar with roam.
No, but it would be a classic. Let's call it a safety observation.
Right.
Yeah.
Any
thoughts on that from the panel?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think one of the concerns I have is, again, we're now setting targets, and so we're starting to pervert what is going to occur. So I can walk out, I can have a totally meaningless conversation with someone and tick the box that I've done that. We need to somehow figure out how to understand the quality of that interaction and not just keep counting task numbers, because task numbers can easily be ticked and move on. We actually need to make sure we're getting quality interaction there.
Yeah. Right on. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. And what I have found is that when managers and executives go out into the field and they have these really meaningful conversations and they learn something, there must be an expectation that they bring that conversation back to the boardroom. Let's talk about what we heard. Let's talk about what we learned. Let's talk about what our people are concerned about and what we can do as executives to create a safer working situation for them.
Yeah, for years we used to say leaders used to feel like they were actually out there looking for problems to solve. And what unfortunately would happen is people would actually get banged on the head when anything was non-conforming. Obviously, the intent is the issue here. Am I intending to go out there to learn, or am I intending to go out there to actually find non-conforming situations? And I think one's far more positive than the other.
And one of the things that I love to tell people as well is you actually want to go out and catch people doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Because that's actually what's delivering value to your business. Recognizing people when they do the right thing, more so than trying to catch them out doing the wrong thing, because that drives a very negative culture in an organization that will lead to people hiding.